Welcome to tonight's Dharma talk. Tonight I'd like to talk about spiritual pleasure and the cultivation of joy, happiness, contentment and peace, or equanimity. So the Buddha expounded to be cautious about worldly pleasures. The Buddha cautioned about worldly pleasures because they can lead to attachments which are the cause of suffering or the cause of dukkha. However, he said, don't be afraid of spiritual pleasure, because this can lead to a sublime states of mind and also deeply refined, concentrated ordered states of consciousness that are called jhanas. And jhanas give us the power and the clarity for insight. So, spiritual pleasure can arise in response to moving along the Eightfold Path. And throughout the sutras, there's something like this being mentioned. Concentration has a proximal cause, happiness. Happiness has a proximal cause, tranquility. Tranquility has a proximal cause, rapture. Rapture has a proximal cause, gladness. Now rapture, sometimes that's translated as joy, and in Pali it's piety. It's this experience of energy and buoyancy. So what is gladness and how does it arise? In my view, gladness is a form of spiritual pleasure, and we can find spiritual pleasure in many different ways. We can find spiritual pleasure in being generous, being kind. We can find spiritual pleasure in doing wholesome deeds, or having a wholesome activity, planning a wholesome activity and seeing it through to its success and finality. That gives us spiritual pleasure. And we can also find spiritual pleasure in actually overcoming the hindrances. There's the hindrances of obsessive desire or sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and agitation, or restlessness and worry, and paralyzing doubt. The Buddha once compared the joy of overcoming the hindrances to, for the first one, the sensual pleasures, it's like being free from debt, the joy of being free from debt, the pleasure of being free from debt. There's a subtle pleasure there. For overcoming ill will, it's the joy, it's the same sort of joy we have from overcoming a horrible affliction, a health affliction. For the freedom of, for overcoming sloth and torpor, he compared it to the joy or the pleasure of being released from prison. And for restlessness and agitation, he compared it to the pleasure or the joy of being released from slavery. And the final one, paralyzing doubt, I really like this one. He compared it to the pleasure or the joy of arriving at a destination after an arduous and dangerous journey, arriving safely at a destination with all your goods intact after an arduous and dangerous journey. So there's many ways in life that we can cultivate spiritual pleasure, and also we can find spiritual pleasure when we develop concentration, when we cultivate concentration, when we go along the path of refining our attention and letting our attention become settled, collected, and unitary, while going in the same direction. So when we can, say, concentrate on spiritual pleasure, when we can start to find some spiritual pleasure, and then we let our attention settle on it, it can lead to joy, it can lead to piety. Just as I mentioned earlier, the rapture or piety or joy has a proximal cause, and this proximal cause is gladness. And I'm talking about gladness. This is my opinion, but I think that gladness is this spiritual pleasure. It may not be profound, but it can be slight, but it leads to, when we can nourish it, when we can attend to it, when we can allow it to grow, it will transform to rapture or piety. And when we attend to piety, this can transform to subtle happiness. And in Pali, happiness is called sukha. And when we attend to sukha with gentle attention, we nourish it with our attention, it can transform to what's a mix of happiness and equanimity. I think the word is contentment, like a kind of a peace. But it's not joyous. I mean, it's not overwhelmingly rapturous. It's just this happiness and peace. It's a peacefulness. And when we can nourish that, settle into that, stabilize our attention on that, it can give rise to a deep equanimity, which is free from, it's so refined that it's not necessarily happy necessarily. It's not, it doesn't have pleasure or displeasure. It's a very subtle, unshaken peacefulness, if that makes sense. So I hope I'm helping you understand that about causes and conditions. You know, dependent arising, which is, I've probably talked about it another time, is this understanding, or it's the principle by which the Buddha explained how things come to be, and also how they cease. And it's about conditionality. One thing conditions another, and this thing conditions another. So, you know, in the sutras it says something like, there's often explained about dependent arising as quite complex, difficult to understand. However, there's a phrase in the sutras that explains it. And it goes something like this: when this is, that is. With the arising of this, that arises. When this is not, that is not. With the ceasing of this, that ceases. So with that kind of an understanding of that, what we can do is we can create proximal causes, if that makes sense. We can understand these causes and conditions, and if we incline our mind to the wholesome, then wholesomeness will more likely arise, if that makes sense. So I'm talking about this process of now being attentive to pleasure and noticing this subtle, you know, being attended to it, getting absorbed into it if you can, and that will give rise to piety, which will give rise to sukha, which will give rise to contentment, which will give rise to this deep peacefulness. So I'm talking about here the features of the four rupa jhanas, or the material jhanas. And again, just to remind you, jhanas are these altered states of consciousness that arise from deeply refined concentration, basically. Meditative concentration, deep concentration, and absorption into experience. So the features of the material jhanas, there's material jhanas and there's amaterial jhanas. Sometimes the jhanas are called absorptions. And the features of the first four jhanas, and that's what I'll focus on tonight. The feature of the first jhana is rapture or joy. The feature of the second jhana is happiness or sukha. A feature of the third jhana is contentment, or this mix of happiness and equanimity. And a feature of the fourth jhana is equanimity, and it is this unshaken, balanced state that's unshaken by the ways of the world. The analogies for the four jhanas are like these, and they're really lovely. The analogy of developing the first jhana is like soap flakes being kneaded into a ball with moisture. Apparently, in the time of the Buddha, if you went to have a bath, there would be a bathman, and he would get his apprentice to make a ball of soap for you. So it's the soap flakes, they knead them into a ball. And it's like this kind of experience of things becoming unified, if that makes sense, into one thing. Separate flakes coming unified through your massaging them. The analogy that's used for the second jhana is like a cool spring in a warm water lake or a warm pond. Like you're in a warm pond and it's very hot on the outside, but there's a cool spring and it starts to come up through the pond or the lake, and it starts to transform the temperature of the lake. It's just this beautiful feeling coming up in your body, and it's like this lightness of heart. I guess you could say you experience it in your heart. This, what is it like? It's like I've heard it described like a cool breeze on a warm day, or as like a cool water coming up in the spring in a pond, in a warm lake. So it's a lovely analogy. The analogy for the third jhana, which has this feature of contentment, is like a lotus plant, fully immersed in the water. And the lotus plant, the stem of the lotus plant and the flower, if there is a flower, I think it's probably just a stem at this point, is saturated with water. So this feeling of contentment saturates our body, saturates our being. And the analogy used for the fourth jhana is like a person covered with a luminous sheet, bright. So one gets this sense of one's covered with this luminous sheet, and there's a sort of an insulation. There's an insulation from the ways of one is insulated from the ways of the world. One's not disturbed by the ways of the world, yet one is brightly aware of the world. And brightly aware of, just bright awareness. So this is the analogy that's used for, how am I going for time? Good. Used for equanimity and this fourth jhana. Well, equanimity, actually there's different types of equanimity, and this is the type of equanimity related to concentration or concentrated states. So the Buddha basically talked about, even though he didn't talk about this actually, he taught meditation, he taught the way to awakening, he taught the Eightfold Path, he taught dukkha and the way to be free from dukkha, basically. And 9 centuries later, there was this text edited that it's called the Path of Purification. It's called the Visuddhimagga in Pali, but it's the Path of Purification. And it was edited by a scholar called Buddhaghosa. Buddhaghosa. And he didn't write it. He just collected all these commentaries from meditation practitioners. And it became the gold standard of meditation, basically. I've got a copy of it, an English copy of it at home. It's about that thick. And it just goes into details about all sorts of meditations. And in that, it says there was it wasn't until that text was written that there, as far as I understand, there was a bifurcation between serenity and insight approaches to meditation. The Buddha taught these ways, but he didn't articulate them in this way. He didn't say, oh, no, go off and do serenity meditation, oh, go off and do insight meditation. It was bifurcated in this text. And another way, so basically there emerged three paths to awakening. The first path would be serenity first. In other words, deep concentration and absorption into states such as the jhanas, and then using these jhanas as powerful tools to see into phenomena. So it's serenity first, then insight. And that's the way the Buddha did it. He after his period of self-denial and self-mortification, he realized that it wasn't working. And he said, why am I afraid of pleasure? And he recollected a time when he was only a young boy in the fields of his father, underneath a black plum tree. And he was secluded from sensual desire, he was secluded from the hindrances, and he had spontaneously experienced rapture, bliss, the first jhana. And he said to himself, this is the way, this is the way. It's not this way of self-mortification, beating myself up, almost dying. This is the way. And he said, I don't need to be afraid of this type of pleasure. I don't need to be afraid of this type of spiritual pleasure. So it said he built himself up, he regained some weight, he gained his strength, and then he sat under the Bodhi tree, and as the story goes, he proceeded to go through the first four jhanas. He didn't go into the immaterial jhanas, but he found those first four jhanas, and the fourth jhana in particular, powerful enough for him to cultivate, sort of see clearly into phenomena and wake up. So this is the path of the Buddha, serenity first and then insight. Yet there are other paths as well, and what we find in contemporary practices, I think, is a lot of discussion about insight meditation. And insight meditation is essentially the four establishments of mindfulness. Mindfulness of body, feelings, mind and phenomena. And what they said in the Visuddhimagga is that you can go the serenity first, insight then insight, or you can go insight only. It's called dry insight. So insight only, and you wake up. And there's yet another way, and that is insight and serenity co-joined. And what we have in the Anapanasati practice, the Anapanasati Sutta, is this beautiful co-joining of serenity and insight. And I've talked about Anapanasati at different times. So anyway, when I first started practicing meditation about 50 years ago, I thought, I'll try this serenity first and then insight. And after about a year or two, I just kind of gave up, because I realized that I was practicing according to the Visuddhimagga, and I just gave up because it seemed like impossible. And not that it was impossible, but only people who were really, really concentrated, a few rare beings, could achieve these sublime states. So I practiced the insight only practice, and it was very satisfactory. I had progress, and it was all very practical, and I could use that. Then, about 25 years later, which is about 25 years ago, I was on a self-retreat, and I was, I think it was about 2 weeks. I was up at the Forest Retreat Centre, actually, and I took the Majjhima Nikaya, the volume of that, with me. So I'd be meditating during the day, and at night I'd light a candle and I'd read the suttas by candlelight. It was a way, because I'd get tired in the evenings. I thought, if I read the suttas, I'll stay awake. So, And I came across a sutta that was called the Kayagata Sati Sutta. And basically this translates as mindfulness immersed in the body sutta. And it's Majjhima Nikaya 119. That's the sutta number. And in it, I read about these 4 jhanas, the 4 material jhanas. And I went, what? They're talking about these 4 jhanas as being representative of mindfulness of the body. And this was in opposition to what I read in the Visuddhimagga, where they said, these jhanas, you lose contact with your body, you go off into a particular state, and there's a complete seclusion from senses. So I read more, and then I read about these experiences, like, snowflakes being kneaded into a ball and evenly distributed, a cool spring in a warm lake, and so on. I thought, I know those experiences. I've had those experiences. So I became interested in what was explained in the suttas in comparison to what was explained in the Visuddhimagga, in the path of purification. And I realized that, hey, they're different. It's actually possible to experience jhanas, even if they're at a very low level. And so I realized there's disagreements, scholastic disagreements, scholarly disagreements, and with practitioners as well. And I thought, well, I don't care if I achieve this magnificent state of consciousness. I found that even if I practiced at very, very low levels, that I could experience some relative happiness, I could experience some relative joy, I could experience some relative contentment and peace. And then I started studying with Lee Brasington, and Lee Brasington's often been criticised as teaching jhana light. He doesn't really teach the jhanas, he just teaches this other way, it's jhana light. And he recommended, I really like Lee, and I've studied with him, I've practiced with him many times. And one suggestion he made is that you concentrate strongly, then when you feel some pleasure in your body, attend to that. And lo and behold, it works, because you can lead on to, different experiences. So, like I said, I wasn't really concerned with scholarly arguments, and what was important for me, even if I emulated these highly profound jhanas, they were working for me to find happiness. So, what I found was that not only were they working for me to bring me happiness, but I could also use them to heal past wounds. And I could also use them in my clinical practice to help others heal past wounds. I'll help others find states of mind that are uplifting, helpful. And I came across Rick Hanson's work. And Rick Hanson, he's a neuropsychologist and neuroclinical psychologist, and also a very good meditation teacher, wonderful man. And he teaches something called HEAL. That's an acronym for this process. And so HEAL refers to having a wholesome experience or having an uplifted experience, enriching it and absorbing into it. So the HEA stands for that, like having a wholesome experience, an uplifting experience, enriching it and absorbing into it. And now I'm thinking, well, this is like cultivating serenity. It's like some ways we work with serenity is you prioritize your attention with this rather than that. So when you can prioritize your attention, you actually I'll come back a bit. There's a saying in psychology made by William James, who's a forefather of modern psychology. He said something like this: what we attend to becomes our reality. That's true. And there's another phrase that I want to bring from neuroscience that helps explain this process. And this phrase is, neurons that fire together wire together. And there's another phrase in neuroscience that says, use it or lose it. So what this means for me, and what I understand by this, it means that if we have a tendency, for example, to feed into, with our attention and with ruminations and worry and unwholesome patterns, it'll strengthen that pathway. If, on the other hand, we turn our attention to something that is wholesome, uplifting, even neutral, then we no longer feed into those neural pathways that represent worry and rumination and the misery and depression, and rather we cultivate something that's wholesome. So with serenity meditations, you choose to prioritize one direction of attention, and you choose to not feed into another pathway of attention. So I won't go into details about the heal process, except to say the L of heal stands for linking. And here, what we do is we link an unwholesome pattern with a wholesome pattern. And first of all, we make the wholesome pattern so strong that we're completely engaged with it. And then we bring a memory of the unwholesome pattern, or the unwholesome memory, or the traumatic memory, if you want, to mind, but you keep it in the background, but it just comes to mind, and it's paired with this other wholesome pattern, and it just dissolves away. The unwholesome pattern dissolves away. So this is, that's a brief summary of something quite detailed. It's a theory called memory reconsolidation theory, if you're a psychologist or interested in the theories. But I really like this analogy that's in the sutras, but it's not referring to this. It's an analogy of putting a tablespoon of salt into a glass of water, or a cup of water or something, and then trying to drink it. You can't drink it because it's so salty. But if you put that same tablespoon of salt into a pristine, pure lake, a mountain lake, the water is not polluted, it's completely clean. If you put that salt into that pristine lake, and you took a glass of water and you drank from the pristine lake, that spoonful of salt would be irrelevant. It wouldn't make any difference. And this is how it is healing. So I hope I've explained something about spiritual pleasure, and how not to be afraid of spiritual pleasure, and how we can shift our state of mind with what we attend to, and how these principles we find in serenity meditation. And serenity meditation can provide a mind that is fit for purpose, for insight. And through this way we can wake up. So thank you for listening, thank you for your attention, thank you for your wise attention, and may we all wake up to the reality of Nibbana.